actually getting at something that is real here. Sometimes people take up positions and treat them as self-evident without doing the work of finding out why those positions are actually correct. Sure, systemic racism exists, but how does it actually manifest? Or, sure, immigration is good, but why is it good? This shortcoming is also what allows people like Steve Crowder to start convincing when talking to someone on a college campus who is overestimating the strength of their own arguments. In this case specifically, Ben Shapiro is making a very bad argument, if an argument at all. The person he is talking to seems unequipped to challenge what he is. If Ben desperately wanted to fight racism, but struggles to find instances of it being systemic, he doesn't have to wait for a college student to point it out to him. He could just look it up. Believe it or not, there are people outside of campuses who talk about this, write books that receive national awards, documentaries, TED Talks. I don't know if Ben is simply unaware of this, or if to him all these people are virtue signaling or trying to score woke points or whatever. Ben's complaint that systemic racism is too big of a term is one that he breaks up a lot, so it seems like he is really struggling to find instances of it actually existing. There are a bunch of different things one could point to when talking about systemic racism, but for now, I'm just going to bring up one, and that is voter ID laws. These are laws passed by state governments that put up hurdles to someone being able to vote in elections. These hurdles range from banning same-day voter registration or cutting early voting days to requiring state-issued photo IDs to cast a vote. The typical response to the idea of voter ID laws being an example of systemic racism by people who don't believe it exists is to ask how it could possibly be racist. Believing black people are less capable of acquiring an ID is the real racism going on here. And it's true that just asking for an ID to allow someone to vote doesn't seem racist at all. But let's say, to use one of Ben's speech habits, let's say people who make those laws request data on which IDs are mostly used by black people, the days on which black people vote, and similar information, and then proceed to restrict the ability to vote precisely on that data. Because this is exactly what happened in North Carolina in 2016, where a federal court struck down a law introduced by Republican legislators that, according to the judges, targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. The legislators in this instance went out of their way to exclude many of the photo IDs and get rid of voting methods predominantly used by black citizens with the aim of reducing their turnout in elections. North Carolina is far from being the only state to enact voter ID laws, although racial bias is rarely as obvious for those as it was in North Carolina. Often these laws focus on putting up financial and geographical barriers to being able to vote. I'm sure most of you watching had the experience of needing something from a government agency, but they were only open for like 2 hours on a Wednesday when you had to work or something. In addition to that, there is simply no justification for these kinds of laws. The main argument by legislators introducing voter ID laws is that they are necessary to combat voter fraud and to make it harder to impersonate someone else at the ballot box. The problem with this line of argumentation is that voter fraud, despite what many Republicans will tell you, simply isn't a big problem in the United States. The vast majority of studies and analysis when it comes to things like voter impersonation fraud, non-citizen or non-resident voting, claims of fraud predicated on list matching methods, and other alleged methods of voter fraud show that it is not an issue to be concerned with from a legislator's point of view. Or, as a study by political scientists at Stanford and the University of Wisconsin put it, virtually all major scholarship on voter impersonation fraud, based largely on specific allegations and criminal investigations, has concluded that it is vanishingly rare and certainly nowhere near the numbers necessary to have an effect on any election. There is still a lot of research to be done when it comes to determining the effect of these laws on voter turnout, and in which instances the enactment is motivated by the intent to suppress the minority vote. What is undeniable, though, is that these laws in places like North Carolina and other states, where they were eventually struck down on grounds of racial bias, are an example of systemic. When Obama was president, how is there still this level of obvious racism? When looking at the history of the United States from the beginning of slavery to the election of Barack Obama, it's obvious that throughout the US's existence, there has been a tremendous amount of racial progress. What is easy to miss, though, is that simultaneously, there's also been a lot of racist progress, with laws and social attitudes becoming more progressive over time. It led to racist ideas such as free shows, and so often here conservatives or classical liberals make the point that there are no laws prohibiting explicitly African Americans from doing anything, so how could there possibly still be systemic racism? And the answer to that is rather easy, and it's also why in the case of North Carolina, nowhere did the law explicitly mention black people. Yeah, because that's illegal, You can't get away with it. In the dichotomy I just mentioned, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 not only outlawed intentional discrimination, but also forced people who wanted to discriminate to do it in a way where it wasn't obvious that that's what they're doing. And this is exactly what happened in North Carolina, among other states. Now, in the instance of North Carolina, the appeals court struck down the voter ID law in mid-2016, so roughly when our first Ben Shapiro clip takes place. Let's move to 2018, where Ben Shapiro is asked about voter ID laws during a lecture titled White Privilege, Microaggressions, and Other Leftist Myths.
And as far as the right, it's still important. I have to buy alcohol, it seems to me that I should have to choices or international people on it. It seems to me it's a bit more like a decision than what's happened here. I get whether I buy crappy tea.
Okay, a reoccurring question you'll be asking yourself when learning about legislative positions that someone who's also pointed this out. Is this simply ignorance on behalf of them, or intentional dishonesty? The case of North Carolina was pretty big news at the time, and I would argue that if you're a political commentator, you have some sort of responsibility to inform yourself to the best of your abilities about the issues you talk about. In Ben's defense, though, while he doesn't seem willing to address obvious instances of systemic racism like North Carolina's voter ID law, the people that work for him are. On Ben Shapiro's website, there's an article by Aaron Bandler that was written in response to the court's appeal rejection titled 5 Statistics That Show Voter ID is Not Racist. The article is linked in the description if you want to check it out, but I'll summarize it for you. Racists. The first 2 statistics are about voter ID laws actually not decreasing voter turnout, but that could also be attributed to these laws often causing a backlash, leading to more voter registration. The third and fourth one are an attempt to show voter fraud actually exists and could make a difference in a close election. And the last one is a statistic showing that a majority of Americans support voter ID laws. Now let me juxtapose this article responding to the court's ruling with how the court justified the decision in the case of North Carolina. The state argued before the district court that the General Assembly enacted changes to early voting laws to avoid political gamesmanship with respect to the hours and locations of early voting centers. As evidence of justifications for the changes to early voting, the state offered purported inconsistencies in voting hours across counties, including the fact that only some counties had decided to offer Sunday voting. The state then elaborated on its justification, explaining that counties with Sunday voting in 2014 were disproportionately black and disproportionately Democratic. In response, SL 20133831 did away with one of the 2 days of Sunday voting. Thus, in what comes as close to a smoking gun as we are likely to see in modern times, the state's very justification for challenge statutes hinges explicitly on race. Specifically, it's concerned that African Americans who have overwhelmingly voted for Democrats had too much access to the franchise. So, not only did the legislators in North Carolina request data regarding the voting habits of black people specifically and went on to use that data to disenfranchise the black vote, they even said so in court. There's simply no way to spin this. This is racism on a systematic level. If voting ID laws are actually successful in reducing minority turnout, or if they depress voter turnout generally, or a majority of Americans support voter ID laws generally, there's no relevance to this. This article just comes off as a bitter response from someone unwilling to face reality out of political bias. In other words, they are putting their feelings over objective to get and doing a thing. Anyway, I don't know which is worse, this article on Ben Shapiro's website or his own response of, well, I don't think voter ID laws are discriminatory because I need to show that I need to buy a crappy Xenon, LOL. Okay, time to move on from this onto the next topic on our 2 or 3 Ben Shapiro's takes on systemic racism. Now we're going to take a look at the topic of mass incarceration, which also is often used as an example of racism on a systematic level in the United States. Let's jump into Ben's response when asked about this at some college.
So to begin with, I don't believe in the concept of mass incarceration because that implies only black people in class so rarely other things into approach. I don't think that's happening. Every person who's in jail has had a trial or the idea that people are just being grabbed and put in prison to utilize the prison industrial complex or the prison masters are the ones running the system.
No one who talks about mass incarceration alludes it to people just being snatched off the streets for no reason. No one. Ben's claim that the term mass incarceration implies a bunch of innocent people being locked up, like, I don't even know what to say to that. Where is the implication there exactly? Mass incarceration is simply the term used to describe the massive spike in U.S. incarceration rates since the 1970s. Since that time, U.S. crime rates have largely fluctuated, similar to crime rates in Western European countries, with no significant changes either way, up until a massive spike in the 1980s, and now a strong decline since the 1990s. Now, let's take a look at the incarceration rate. This is what's meant when someone uses the term mass incarceration. The gigantic increase of prisoners, not explainable by our crime rates, that has now led to a situation where 25% of the world's prison population is incarcerated in the United States. Granted, there are a lot of people living in the US as a whole, but even looking at incarceration rates proportional to population size, it's still 8 times higher than Germany's, for instance. This growth in incarceration rates over the past 40 years is both historically unprecedented and internationally unique. Apart from that, Ben is getting at something really important here when he says every person in jail has had a trial or a play, because that's not true. It's not even the absolute majority, depending on the type of prison. A huge chunk of people in prison are innocent under the law, but are held in confinement awaiting their trial. One reason that number of unconvicted people is so large is because of cash bail, in which a defendant can pay a certain amount of money as a guarantee to attend future court hearings. If you don't have that money and no way of getting it, you might be there for weeks, months, and in some cases even years, leading you to lose your job, home, or family. If the person doesn't want to wait until their day of trial, or they don't have the money for bail, they're usually offered a plea deal by the prosecution. Usually this means pleading guilty and avoiding trial in exchange for some leniency. The reason why this deal is so seductive for someone awaiting their trial is something called mandatory sentencing, which is a policy that established a minimum time served for certain crimes. For instance, in Kentucky, the standard mandatory sentence for a first-time drug offense is 2 to 10 years in prison, depending on the drug, compared to 6 months or no jail time at all in other developed countries. That allows the prosecution to speak in before the trial even takes place and offer, let's say, 1 year sentence if you plead guilty right away and do not go to trial. Unsurprisingly, this is how the vast majority, over 90% to be precise, of people are convicted in the US. If every single person accused of a crime tried to prove their innocence in court, the system would get completely overwhelmed. So this is one aspect that contributes to mass incarceration, and we'll talk more about that in a second. In this encounter, Ben got unlucky since the person he is addressing came prepared and was able to point to specific instances of racial disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine that Ben seems eager to address. Before we listen to that, though, I can't really convince you about my position without knowing how this law would be in the first place. So, basically, we want those. Some of this stuff might be emotionally challenging. Today in 2020, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement as a whole are generally judged as positive and necessary. If you would have asked a lot of Americans back in the 60s when it was actually active, that was not the case. Especially in the South, people freaking hated MLK and the civil rights movement. If you wanted to be taken serious, though, you couldn't just say, I don't like the civil rights movement because of my aversion to black people. Instead, Southern governors and opponents of civil rights in general went around depicting MLK's philosophy of civil disobedience as a leading cause of crime. In an article named If Mob Rule Takes Hold in the US, a warning to Richard Nixon, the then vice president warned that an increasing crime rate can be traced directly to the spread of the corrosive doctrine that every citizen possesses an inherent right to decide himself which laws to obey and when to disobey them. Other politicians who wanted to uphold racial segregation, like Representative John Bell Williams, went further and just said outright what Nixon was strongly implying with his statement. This exodus of Negroes from the South and their influx into the great metropolitan centers of other areas of the nation has been accompanied by a wave of crime. What has civil rights accomplished for these areas? Segregation is the only answer, as most Americans, not the politicians, have realized for hundreds of years. Ultimately, though, the segregationists lost that fight, but it's important to keep in mind that just because the Civil Rights Act was passed, it didn't magically turn all those people who were against it super woke. Around that time, the language of blatant racism that forming at the mouth segregationists used wasn't suitable for the mainstream anymore, and voters were more and more turned off by it, because nobody likes to see themselves as racist. And most people who were opposed to civil rights didn't see themselves that way either. They were worried about crime, law and order collapsing, and stuff like that. It's just that the speaker of this is the campaign of Richard Nixon in 1968. Historian Ibram X. Kendi was elected in his book Stand from the Beginning. Nixon framed his campaign, as a close advisor explained, to allow potential supporters to avoid admitting to himself that he was attracted by the racist appeal. How did he do that? Easy. Demean black people and praise white people without ever saying black people or white people. Usually this kind of politics is called the Southern strategy, in which Republicans try to form a new majority in the country consisting of Northern and Southern anti-black racists, warhawks, as well as fiscal and social conservatives. Now again, it's hard to imagine something like that if you're hearing it for the first time. So just as an example, let's watch one of Richard Nixon's campaign ads from 1968.
It is time for an honest look at the problem of order in the United States. This change is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence. Let us recognize that the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States.
For conservatives today, this is obviously a hard pill to swallow, and when stuff like this gets brought up, the reaction by the right is often along the lines of, oh, so everyone who's concerned about crime is a racist? Every Nixon supporter was a racist? Well, no, it's not that necessary. All of us, conservative or progressive, have subconscious biases that affect the way we think. It's just that when it comes to race, we have a harder time accepting that fact because we don't see ourselves in that manner. For instance, if I would ask you what is more likely to be the cause of your demise, despite strokes causing about twice as many deaths as all accidents combined. When surveyed, most people judge tornadoes to kill more people than asthma, although the latter cause about 20 times more deaths. All of us have biases like these in our brains, and things like race or crime are no exception to this. I'll take these two examples from Daniel Kahneman's worldwide bestseller, Thinking, Fast and Slow, and here's how he describes this phenomenon. The lesson is clear. Estimates of causes of death are warped by media coverage. The coverage is itself biased towards novelty and poignancy. The media do not just shape what the public is interested in, but also are shaped by it. Editors cannot ignore the public's demands that certain topics and viewpoints receive extensive coverage. Unusual events attract disproportionate attention and are consequently perceived as less unusual than they really are. The world in our heads is not a precise replica of reality. Our expectations about the frequency of events are distorted by the prevalence and emotional intensity of the messages to which we are exposed. Besides media coverage, one thing distorting our image of reality is obviously political rhetoric, and the Nixon ad we just watched is a perfect example of that. But if you don't want to take my word for it, Nixon reportedly reacted to seeing this ad by saying it hit right on the nose. It's all about those damn Negro Puerto Rican groups out there. And just to eradicate any doubts when it comes to the intent of the law and order rhetoric by Nixon, here are some more quotes. H.R. Haldeman, who was a key advisor to Nixon, said afterwards, President Nixon, emphasized that we have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. Another issue besides crime used for this purpose was drugs, and the perception of drugs being something largely contained to black people lasts to this day. The vast majority of people in the U.S., when asked to envision a drug dealer, describe someone who is black, despite the actual makeup being more like 50-50, with white use even more likely to sell drugs than black use. Here's John Ehrlichman, the special counsel to Nixon, talking about the instrumentalization of drugs in the Nixon campaign. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and black terror, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So this really isn't, left-wing conjecture. These people were completely open about this strategy, which really caused a conservative revolution inside the Republican Party. And worked. Nixon was so successful in gathering up not only opponents of desegregation, but also people with concerns about the civil rights movement, framing his messaging around law and order that in 1968, 81% of respondents in the Gallup poll said they believe Nixon's campaign slogan, "Law and order has broken down in the country." Over the years, this strategy achieved its goal of making the issue of race a wedge yet again, despite slavery and Jim Crow being abolished. The president who deployed it arguably the most effective was Ronald Reagan a couple of years down the line. And with the first Reagan campaign, you saw a really interesting dynamic emerge that plays a significant role in U.S. political commentary even to this day. And I'm sure this comment section will have its fair share of it as well. Reagan kicked off his presidential campaign at the annual Neshoba County Fair near Philadelphia, Mississippi, the town where 3 civil rights activists were murdered in 1964. He assured the crowd, "I believe in states' rights," and promised to restore to states and local governments the power that properly belonged to them. His critics promptly alleged that he was signaling a racial message to his audience, suggesting allegiance with those who resisted desegregation. But Reagan firmly denied it, forcing liberals into a position that would soon become familiar, arguing that something is racist, but finding it impossible to prove in the absence of explicitly racist language. Two major themes of Reagan's campaign were welfare and crime, and naturally the kind of rhetoric deployed by Nixon was all present in how Reagan conducted himself, a lazy black ghetto mother, who was leeching off of honest, hard-working Americans. He was so successful that 22% of Democrats defected from the party to vote for him, with an even higher percentage of Democrats defecting who thought civil rights leaders were pushing too fast. And here's where we get back to the earlier mentioned crack cocaine sentencing disparity. I didn't forget about that. So while Reagan was president, he launched the war on drugs, which heavily shifted the focus of law enforcement towards street crime. Now I won't dwell on this because I know Ben Shapiro's against the war on drugs, but just know the most important issue facing the nation, but put into the context of messaging, you can easily see what goal this war also served. 3 years after Reagan launched the war on drugs, crack hit the US in a major fashion. And it's really hard to understate what a godsend the crack craze was for the governing right. Not only did it hit the time where poverty was rising due to the government of social programs, but also when globalization devastated manufacturing in the United States. A lot of those jobs held in urban areas belonged to the black population, who disproportionately lacked college degrees and had attended racially segregated, highly underfunded schools. With crack in those communities at that time, it gave the right a convenient scapegoat for all these social ills popping up. It's not that our policies, like gutting social programs and not mitigating the downsides of globalization, caused this high amount of violent poverty. It's actually just crack. Here's how it outlined in the New York Times warned this easy way out at the time. If we blame crime on crack, our politicians are off the hook. Forgotten are the failed schools, the malign welfare programs, the desolate neighborhoods, the wasted years. Only crack is to blame. One is tempted to think that if crack did not exist, someone somewhere would have received the federal grant to develop it. This critical voice in the Times was a pretty lonely one, though, because the media went right along with whipping up this frenzy of the crack epidemic that was destroying America. Here's what New York City DEA director in 1985 wrote a statement to say afterwards. That's Drug Enforcement Agency, by the way. The agents would hear me give hundreds of presentations to the media as I attempted to call attention to the drug scourge. I wasted no time in pointing out the DEA's new accomplishments against the drug traffickers. In order to convince Washington, I needed to make drugs, a national issue, and quickly. I began a lobbying effort and I used the media. The media were only too willing to cooperate because, as far as the New York media was concerned, crack was the hottest combat reporting story to come along since the end of the Vietnam War. Despite all of that, you might still object to me characterizing someone supporting harsh punitive measures for crime, and especially drug-related crime, to racial bias. And it's not like I don't get that. It's extremely hard to figure out why large groups of people support specific policies, especially when we figure in subconscious bias. Maybe a lot of people really were concerned about crime and drugs and have no animus towards minorities at all. I'm certain that the vast majority of people back then saw their own motivation for supporting these policies in that manner. Be that as it may, what I would say disproves these supposedly colorblind motivations is that studies since the 70s have shown that crime rates or likelihood of victimization were only secondary factors looking at white support for backing the get tough on crime and anti-welfare measures. The single biggest indicator researchers found was racial attitudes. As Michelle Alexander puts it, The war on drugs, cloaked in race-neutral language, offered whites opposed to racial reform a unique opportunity to express their hostility towards blacks and black progress without being exposed to the charge of racism. So, in this very irrational climate, legislation was passed that heavily penalized drug-related crime, but also disproportionately punished the possession of crack cocaine, which was associated with inner-city blacks, from powder cocaine, which was more seen as a drug of affluent whites. And I'll tell you how big that disparity was in a second, because I first want to play Ben's response to a student bringing up the crack cocaine powder cocaine sentencing disparity as an example of racism in the criminal justice system.
As far as the 1986 law, I think it was important to context. The context is that law was originally passed by black legislators in their cities who received a bunch of crack cocaine to storm their communities. And the reason for this disparity is because crack was more easily distributed and significantly more effective than powder cocaine. It is also that the vast majority of people were distributing using crack cocaine were black. The rest of the vast majority of people distributing using white crystal meth. Guess what the penalty is for 1 ounce of crystal meth versus 1 ounce of crack cocaine? They are identical. They're identical because they are easily distributed and they're distributed in similar form. So the idea that this is just some sort of attempt to grab black people off the street and put them in jail for no reason so you can have a permanent underclass of people with no fathers, this seems to me like a giant conspiracy theory.
Okay, so let's see if what we're talking about is actually a giant conspiracy theory. I don't really know what Ben means when he says the 1986 drug law was pushed by black legislators, or why that would even matter. The question is not, is this the fault of white people, but is it discriminatory in effect? How many black legislators supported the bill is completely irrelevant to that question. Also, when Congress revisited the drug policy in 1988 and introduced even more punitive measures, 6 of the only 11 negative votes on the new Drug Abuse Act came from the Congressional Black Caucus. But anyway, not really important. So Ben's attempt to justify the existing disparity by saying crack is significantly more effective and easier to distribute than other cocaine, folks, this is absolutely laughable. I can't even believe that's an argument someone would honestly try to make. This bill mandated a 5-year minimum sentence without parole for being caught with nearly 5 grams of crack cocaine. The amount of powder cocaine you need to be carrying for the same sentence was 100 times that, half a kilo. Even if you think there should be a disparity, sell half a kilo of powder cocaine as 5 grams of crack cocaine, then machine gunning out these counter-arguments does not make them any less ridiculous, I'm afraid. The next point Ben brings up is the sentencing disparity between powder cocaine and crystal meth to, I guess, indicate that people pointing to decriminalizing of crack as evidence of racial bias are just cherry-picking, and that this disparity also exists for white people because they are overrepresented in crystal meth use. And this might be a good argument. That is also weakening his own argument here, because from what I could find, the possession of meth usually leads to a harsher sentence than the possession of crack. Here's the thing though, that might be the case now. The only reason the disparities are similar is because the 100-to-1 crack cocaine disparity was reduced to 18-to-1 with the Fair Sentencing Act passed by the Obama administration. Until then, that had not been the case. Meth was really more of a thing of the late 90s or early 2000s, and even today, more black people are arrested for possessing crack cocaine than white people for possessing meth. They both pale in comparison to the arrests made because of marijuana, in which minorities are also overrepresented, despite similar usage rates. And even if all of that wasn't the case, usage rates don't necessarily translate to arrest and conviction rates. In 1996, 10 years after the Drug Abuse Act, 2/3 of crack users were white or Latino, but still almost 85% of defendants convicted of crack possession were black. Instead of bringing up a bunch of nonsense, they could have so easily deflected this issue into the Democrats, saying, well, if you have a problem with mass incarceration, you should put the blame on Bill Clinton, etc., etc. Because that's actually true. Creating the problem of mass incarceration was a bipartisan effort in the U.S. The last point he makes is that the vast majority of people who are in jail are supposedly in jail for selling drugs and not for using them.
As far as the idea that, I think it's important again to note this. Exactly, the vast majority of people who are in jail for drug crimes are in for distribution, not merely for use. The idea that the system doesn't have time for that.
I don't want to get ahead of myself here because this isn't the only time Ben will bring up the makeup of the prison population as an argument, but just know that 4/5 of drug violation arrests are for possession. Next, Ben is confronted with the fact that black and white people use drugs at similar rates, but that blacks are disproportionately in prison for it. Let's see how our friend in the audience responds.
Higher numbers of black people than white. It is absolutely ridiculous. And as I said, people are generally not arrested for using drugs, they're generally arrested for drug distribution. Well, things in terms of proportionality with regard to, and the idea that, again, you need to show me statistics on drug distribution. So the burden is on you to prove the disparity, not on you to prove it not.
As we just discovered, possession is completely not true. But even if that was true, is Ben trying to say that white and black people use drugs at similar rates, but the drug dealers are all black people, and that's the reason for the disparity? And you can see Ben get kind of flustered when this statement is called into question, and he switches to saying he doesn't have the statistics in front of him, despite seconds earlier confidently saying it's absolutely true that black people commit more of these crimes. Luckily, I do have the statistics at hand, and I bet you could see this coming by now. White people sell drugs at similar, if not higher rates than black people, but are less likely to get arrested and overall receive milder convictions for the same offense. There's no way to win this argument for them. His attempts to push back against the idea that the criminal justice system produces racially biased outcomes just seems desperate and stubborn in the face of overwhelming evidence. There's one last thing I want to address when we talk about mass incarceration that I've seen Ben repeatedly bring up, and that is that the majority of people who sit in prison are actually not incarcerated for drug-related crimes. So petty drug crimes can be the driving factor of mass incarceration. And seeing Ben make this argument multiple times really got on my nerves because it's such a dishonest tactic, it's unreal. As an example, I'm going to show you a clip from the bench that makes this exact point among other things.
The fellow deputy director of legal policy over in Manhattan is going to get a very important piece this week about our criminal justice system, which is being accused by folks on both right and left. Moving racially low-level like that. Now, a lot of what has been talked about on both right and left like, is what seems to be a lot of purpose, which is that the American criminal justice system is like criminal justice reform, or we need realignment. There's a realignment in California. We need reclassification of crime because obviously there's a vast attempt to grab minority people, men, people out of inner city communities, leaving those communities bereft because the police are out to get low-level offenders in minority communities. What are the facts of this?
Well, the facts are exactly the opposite of what the narrative is, right? The narrative is that we need a center, right? So we've got low levels and we're kind of overflowing in the country, right? And the main target of this critique is usually the drug war, right? That all these non-violent drug offenders, not completely non-violent drug offenders, probably get $2 billion money up. Right? But the reality is, if you look at our system, the vast majority of people serving time behind bars in the United States of America, they're serving time for very serious violent offenses, as well as weapons offenses and other serious property offenses like murder, right? So, for example, with the state system, which houses about 90% of American prisoners, only 14.8% of those prisoners are serving time for a drug offense. 4 times as many are in for one of just 5 very, very serious offenses. Those offenses are murder, rape or sexual assault, robbery, aggravated simple assault, and burglary.
Skipping past Ben's very uncharitable representation of the other side, at first glance, this seems like a great point, doesn't it? When you think about it for a bit, though, it becomes pretty obvious that the makeup of the total prison population doesn't speak at all to the argument that the war on drugs is driving mass incarceration. Of course, when looking at the stock of the prison population, so to say, the biggest chunk of people in prison will be there for serious offenses because those people get longer sentences. This has nothing to do with the argument over the cause of skyrocketing incarceration rates. The prison population is only a snapshot of people going through the justice system. Looking at the state and federal prison admissions by offense type between 1993 and 2009, we can see that nearly a third of total prison admissions over that period were for drug crimes. If we extend that period to 2011 and look at the raw numbers, those are 3 million admissions into federal and state prisons with 13 million arrests for drug crimes taking place over the same period. That is about 3 times the population of Sweden. It's also not like after serving their time, people convicted for petty drug crimes can just re-enter society easily. A big part of even drug offenders get classified as felons, which means depending on the state they live in, they can be legally discriminated against when it comes to things like public housing, education, employment, voting, and even food stamps. One thing that is really a mystery to me, if we follow Ben's line of argumentation that most people who are in prison for drug-related offenses are actually drug dealers, who would not turn into good citizens if left out, as he says when arguing with the former college student, and if the racial disparity is justified with crime rates, and mass incarceration is mostly driven by violent offenders, why would the war on drugs even be bad? It seems like to Ben, everything that is bad about it is either a myth or a giant conspiracy theory. When people talk about the 1986 drug bill or mass incarceration in general, the argument is not that a bunch of racists got together to figure out how they could destroy inner cities and pass that into law. The reality is that this specific legislation, and some after, is an outgrowth of a time in American history where cracking down on drugs and the get tough on crime mentality was widely popular but also raised all black voters in general without explicitly doing so, but doing so nonetheless. Despite all of that, I don't want you to come away from this with the wrong impression. Simply legalizing drugs and releasing those convicted will not solve the issue of mass incarceration. The problem is much bigger than just drug laws. Anyway, adhering to the rule of three, we're going to take a look at the third attempt of Ben to debunk something I would classify as an instance of systemic racism. Our last example truly takes the cake though, and to me, is the last nail in the coffin for anyone trying to claim that is an honest act in regards to this topic. If you follow US politics at all, you probably know that another presidential election is on the horizon. One of the people who threw his hat in the ring to become the Democratic candidate was former mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg. During his luckily short-lived campaign, he was heavily criticized by media outlets and other candidates for overseeing a police practice called stop and frisk, which allowed New York City police to stop, question, and frisk hundreds of thousands of New York City residents for over a decade. The biggest criticism about stop and frisk was the racial disparity of those stops, with the percentage of non-whites usually being around 90% depending on the year. Now, of course, all avoid Ben came to the rescue of Michael Bloomberg, despite him being a Democrat, and explained to his audience how stop and frisk was actually good, and not racist at all, and everyone else is just being woke, I guess.
Back to stop and frisk policies and proactive policing. So the fact is, in the United States, crime rates between 1960 and 1994 spiked dramatically in major cities across the country. In the early 1990s, a lot of cities began to do proactive policing in order to lower crime rates. And the United States underwent one of the greatest crime transformations in history. We lowered our murder rate dramatically in major cities across the country. And that was because of, and these were applied in bipartisan fashion. And Mayor Giuliani became Mayor Giuliani because David Dinkins wasn't going to do any of this stuff. Mayor Richard Reardon in LA became Mayor Richard Reardon because Democrats in LA were not doing this sort of stuff. The attempt to clean up crime was one of the major American success stories between 1994 and 2015, when there was sort of a reverse effect after some of the Ferguson riots. And so the Ferguson effect, when police started backing off out here, they were going to ruin their lives and careers if they engaged in proactive policing. Well, this was a bipartisan coalition that favored lowering crime. And that bipartisan coalition included a lot of black legislators and a lot of black city council members who were sick of watching high crime neighborhoods affecting black people who were living in those high crime neighborhoods.
So this is kind of the backdrop for Ben's argument about stop and frisk, namely that proactive policing, like stopping and frisking people randomly, contributed to the great American success of reducing crime throughout the 90s. And the problem with this theory is that crime dropped sharply not only across the United States, but much of the Western world. And since proactive policing, like in New York, wasn't deployed nationwide, this being the big reason for the huge reduction in crime seems rather unlikely. In addition to that, crime rates continue to drop today, with less proactive policing taking place in New York City. There's by no means a consensus on what exactly caused the drop in crime rates, but one theory that fits much better than Ben's, and this is one that probably stings the most for Ben, is government regulation. If you compare the violent crime rate in the US with the amount of lead in gasoline, the two curves look really similar, but are offset by about 20 years. In case you didn't know, lead is a neurotoxin, and if you're exposed to even small doses, it can cause cell death as well as a bunch of other irreparable damage to the brain. High lead exposure during childhood is also linked to control and other executive functions like emotional regulation and impulse control. One of the things also explained by this theory is the discrepancy of murder rates between big cities and small towns. Since big cities have more cars in smaller areas, which means a higher concentration of atmospheric lead, while the amount of lead in the atmosphere has gotten smaller and smaller over the years, the difference in the murder rates shrunk quite a bit. It is also the case that in states where leaded gasoline was faded out slower, crime declined slower, and in states that did so much faster, crime declined more quickly. But even putting that aside, then would have to substantiate that stop and frisk specifically contributed to the drop in crime, which you should find difficult to do. The studies that have been done aren't really unanimous in their results, but it seems to be the case that if stop and frisk worked at all in New York, the gains were very, very modest, and I would say do not justify the downsides, to which we'll get in a second. The Washington Post also did a fact check on if stop and frisk reduced crime, and deemed that statement unsubstantiated, partially because crime already started dropping before Rudy Giuliani became mayor of New York, and continued to do so after he left office. Anyway, at the end of that clip, Ben also mentioned something called the Ferguson effect, which is the theory that after the uprising in Ferguson that happened after Michael Brown was killed by police, law enforcement got so scared of being called racist that they were reluctant to enforce the law, which allegedly led to an increase in crime rates. And just like with Ben's earlier claim, it's really hard to make out if this effect actually exists, since while crime rates did go up a bit in several cities in that time frame, overall crime in the US continued to drop. One study suggests that if this effect exists at all, it's probably more due to black people being more afraid to cooperate with law enforcement rather than police officers being afraid of losing their job. And even if Ferguson led to some areas being depoliced, that's not necessarily bad because a lot of areas were over-policed prior to that. Be that as it may, let's now look at Ben's reasoning why stop and frisk isn't racist, and why Michael Bloomberg's comments on the policy are factually correct, apparently. I have to jump around in this clip because it's quite long, but you can find the link to it below and make sure I'm not leaving out important context.
Here is Michael Bloomberg talking. This is supposed to be what he's going to end the presidential. Okay, I'm saying this to reduce the gun cost is that get the guns out of it. 4 months against the wall, and you press them. Or if you ask any police officer in your city who stopped fucking the actual legal language. So the minute-long excerpt, Bloomberg says 95% of murderers and murder victims fit one MO. You just take the script and Xerox it and pass it out to all the time. Right, so this is why whether it's asked about racial disproportion is sort of relevant to how he's answering. If he's defending the policy on the basis that it's disproportionate to the general demographic, then that's a problem. He's defending the supposed disproportion on the basis of crime statistics. And he's saying what he's saying is basically correct. Or he's saying is basically true on an actual level, which is that disproportionately the vast majority of crime victims, from murder to violent crimes, robbery in the city of New York, are minorities. And the disproportionate number of perpetrators and suspects are members of this community too. So who do you think that is going to end up getting more often? And that's what Bloomberg is saying. He says that's true in New York, that's true in virtually every state. You want to spend the money, put a lot of cops on the street, but those cops are the targets, which means in minority neighborhoods. Okay, well, that's awkwardly good, but that is true, which is crime is disproportionately in areas that have a disproportionate number of minorities. It just is that. These are turning on Twitter because the way this works is Michael Bloomberg, again, it's a little bit for being president of the United States, and that he was a hapless mayor of New York City, and involved lowering the crime rate. But in the Democratic Party, you're not supposed to run on lower crime rates. You're supposed to run on lower nationally, and you're supposed to run on the basic presupposition that a disproportionate number of the Democratic population, blacks and Hispanics, are arrested. That must reflect criminal justice racism, as opposed to disproportionate crime taking place by black and Hispanic suspects. Here's Michael Bloomberg saying another thing that he's saying who's going up because I'm up to our radio in New York.
They just keep saying, oh, it's a disproportionate percentage of a particular ethnic group. That may be, but it's not a disproportionate percentage of those who witnesses and victims describe as being inaccurate. I think we disproportionately lights too much in the notice to
Okay, that is 100% true. Me and Rick got this, right? Yeah, how can you say what he just said on a factual basis is 100% true. On the basis of crime statistics, if we were just to compare crime reports, numbers of stops and frisks, what you see is that Black and Hispanic suspects are being pulled over less frequently than they are charged in terms of the general crime statistics. Who was getting ripped up and down, and presumably Google is going to come out and apologize. Now, if you had your stone pull over and say, listen, my policy helped literally thousands of Black and Hispanic lives in New York City. Proactive policing saves lives. You want to lower crime rates, and that disproportionately affects people who are living in minority communities, which are high crime areas. If you want to increase the economic growth in those areas, you need more policing, not less.
First off, is stop and frisk racist? No. Stopping someone and frisking them is appropriate. No one is saying it is. The reason why the practice of stop and frisk has been reduced significantly since 2013 is because a federal court determined that the New York City police deployed it in a discriminatory fashion. And honestly, Ben has to know this. Not only was it national news at the time, but he is a lawyer talking about stop and frisk. There's no way he's not aware of this ruling. Another possibility is that he does know that a federal court deemed stop and frisk as deployed by the NYPD to be discriminatory, but disagrees with that ruling since the racial disparity in those stops is explained by minorities disproportionately being involved in criminal activity, which seems to be his reasoning. And this is one of those moments that shows the huge disconnect between academia and conservative positions, because you'd have to be absolutely delusional to believe experts don't incorporate things like crime rates in their mind when seeing a disparity like that. Honestly, seeing this talking points so often is driving me a little nuts because Ben and others always act like they activated their secret QDO logic trap card, when in reality they just have no idea what they're talking about. So let's do better than them and take a look at what some experts wrote when assessing stop and frisk as used by the NYPD. Jeffrey Fagan from Columbia Law School and his colleagues, for instance, wrote a paper called Street Stops and Broken Windows Revisited with 3 relevant findings. First, stops within neighborhoods take place at rates in excess of what would be predicted from the separate and combined effects of population demography, physical and social conditions, and the crime rate. This excess seems to be concentrated in predominantly Black neighborhoods. Second, the excess stops in these neighborhoods persist over time. Even as the Black population declines, crime rates remain low and effectively unchanged. The city's overall social and economic health improves, and housing and other investments increase across the city's neighborhoods, including its poorest and most segregated neighborhoods. Third, there appears to be a declining return in crime detection from marginal increases in enforcement, and this efficiency gap seems to grow over time. The biggest argument for stop and frisk at the time was that it would get guns off the streets, and when looking at how many guns were recovered, you can really see the just mentioned efficiency gap in action. In 2003, the NYPD performed 160,851 stops and recovered 627 guns. In 2011, when the policy was at its peak, the NYPD recovered 780 guns, so definitely progress on that front, no denying that. The number of stops they had to do to get this many guns off the streets was 685,724. In other words, the success rate went from 0.3% in 2003 to 0.1%, or nearly zero, in 2011. Believe it or not, there are people like Mayor Bloomberg, for instance, who say, well, this isn't actually an argument against stop and frisk because the main effect of it is that people get deterred from carrying guns in the first place. If they know they'll be stopped, they won't bring guns. What Mayor Bloomberg and others do not seem to realize is that this kind of justification would by definition make the practice unconstitutional. The Fourth Amendment to the American Constitution requires all police searches and seizures to be, quote, reasonable. Jeffrey Dallin from William and Mary Law School points this out in his paper called The Inverse Relationship Between the Constitutionality and Effectiveness of New York City Stop and Frisk. NYC Stop and Frisk is conceptualized as a program to deter gun carrying necessarily depends on stopping people without individualized suspicion. The theory justifying mass stop and frisk is that people will leave their guns at home to keep their weapons from being uncovered by an officer's frisk. In this scenario, the likelihood of a frisk determines the deterrent effect. If a frisk can be avoided by avoiding criminal activities such as trespassing, public marijuana smuggling, so long as they obey or think they will obey other laws while doing so. Thus, a high volume of arbitrary frisks is essential to effectively deter gun possession. The knowledge that a stop and frisk is almost inevitable powerfully deters gun possession. It concludes, a program of aggressive policing designed to deter unlawful gun carrying like that employed in New York City can either be effective or constitutional, but not both. 7 years before the court ruling, the NYPD asked the Rand Corporation to examine claims of racial bias, and while the researchers advised against the large-scale restructuring of stop and frisk practices, even they found that on top of disparity in stops, 45% of black and Hispanic suspects were frisked, compared to 29% of white suspects. Yet, when frisked, white suspects were 70% likelier than black suspects to have had a weapon on them. Lastly, let's look at some points of the expert opinion that the federal court ruling was based off of. In regards to the Fourth Amendment that is supposed to protect citizens from unreasonable police searches, officers rely heavily on two constitutionally problematic stop justifications for nearly half of all stops: furtive movements and proximity to a high crime area. Documented stop justifications do little to explain overall variations in stop patterns and do not substantially influence the racial disparity that characterize stop practices between police precincts. The rate of gun seizure is 0.15%, or nearly zero, and arrests take place in less than 6% of all stops. Black and Hispanic suspects are treated more harshly once the decision is made that a crime has occurred. Black and Hispanic suspects are more likely to be arrested than issued a summons when compared to white suspects. They are more likely to be subjected to use of force. In regards to the 14th Amendment that is supposed to protect citizens from, among other things, racial discrimination, NYPD stop activity is concentrated in precincts with high concentrations of black and Hispanic residents, even after controlling for the influence of crime, social conditions, and the allocation of police resources. NYPD stops are significantly more frequent for black and Hispanic citizens than for white citizens, even after adjusting for precinct crime rates, the racial composition, and other social and economic factors predictive of police activity. Blacks and Hispanics are more likely to be stopped than whites, even in areas where there are low crime rates and where residential populations are racially heterogeneous or predominantly white. At the risk of repeating myself too much, there is no way to get around the fact that stop and frisk, as deployed by the NYPD, was not only another example of systemic racism, but comes close to a racist terror campaign waged against the minority population of New York City. Looking at the number of stops in 2011 and dividing them by how many days there are in a year, we get nearly 1,900 stops every single day without incorporating holidays. And it's not like these were spread out evenly among the entire city. This is getting defended by the small government guy, by the way. The principled conservative crusading against government overreach has no problem at all with nearly 2,000 people being stopped every single day despite having done literally nothing wrong. It's no surprise that since stop and frisk was deployed on such a massive scale, studies have shown that students heavily exposed to stop and frisk were more likely to struggle in school and eventually drop out entirely. Young men were more likely to experience symptoms of anxiety and depression, and the police pretty much destroyed what was left of police legitimacy in affected communities. At this point, we probably don't even know what the negative effects of this policy, like drops in property value if you bought real estate in affected neighborhoods. If you had a business there, it probably reduced your customers and performance of your employees, and so on. And the reason why I picked this clip of Ben is because this isn't just a one-off. There are numerous stories published on his website showing the same arguments as late as February 2020. This isn't the first video where I go over some claims of Ben Shapiro, but we're taking a much broader look at how Ben approaches issues like systemic racism and revealing something that goes much further than simply hypocrisy or partisan heckling. It seemingly shows a complete disinterest to actually fix social laws in American society, or even approach them in an informed and honest manner. If you view politics as a way to make the world a better place, what Ben is offering is completely backwards. Being conservative and in favor of the status quo on an issue isn't inherently good or bad, but in doing so, lacking the most basic knowledge or simply not caring about it, Ben is doing a massive disservice to its audience. Now, here's where we get to the million-dollar question. Is Ben Shapiro a racist? The answer that I know to be truthful 100% is that I really do not care. But what his role is, and what a lot of effort any conservative movement is dedicated to, is the exact same that Edward Jarvis' article in the New England Journal of Medicine served in its time, and that is to suppress and push back against the resistance to racial discrimination. It's a sad reality that men have such an easy time doing so, since all his answers are so trimmed towards being comfortable. For the average white person who largely interacts with other white people, systemic racism remains somewhat invisible socially, partially because the things we can compare it to are so much more obvious instances of racism like Jim Crow or slavery. The current COVID-19 crisis once again lays bare how the remnants of these systems still manifest today. While we're still in the midst of this crisis, early data shows how minority communities are again disproportionately affected. The YouTube conservative tech response to this will probably be smugly asking, also the virus is racist, LOL? For anyone not as deep in the hole though, it should be easy to acknowledge that while the reasons for this disparity are multifaceted, things like poor quality of air and water, less access to medical care, health insurance, and a higher proximity to industrial toxins make minority communities more vulnerable than others. Or as Gregorio Millet, vice president of the Foundation for AIDS Research, says, it is structural issues that are placing African Americans at greater risk for not only COVID-19, but multiple health conditions that we still have not adequately addressed as a society. When looking back at all the progress that was made, like the abolishing of slavery, the Civil Rights Act, and the first black president, you get this image of political racism slowly dissolving over time. It doesn't just dissolve into nothingness, though. It's more like an aspirin dissolving in a glass of water. Still there, just less obvious to the eye. And I'll admit that initially I had a really hard time understanding how this works. The basic assumption I had, and a lot of other people have, is that what happened in history before I was born basically doesn't affect my life in a significant way. What I found to take for me was when I stumbled over a study examining something seemingly completely unrelated. The study examined one of the leading causes of death for young children in the US, which is drowning. In doing so, the study showed that the rate for black children ages 5 to 19 drowning in swimming pools was more than 5 times as high as those of white children. And one of the reasons the researchers laid out was black people being barred from swimming pools and swimming associations in the past, and thus having institutional barriers in front of them that reduced the number of black people being able to swim. Now you might say, well, that's not the case anymore. They can just make the choice to learn how to swim. But as the study explains, if a parent does not know how to swim, there's only a 13% chance that child will learn how to swim. When adult role models fear water or have been negatively impacted by the above experiences, their comfort level with swimming is passed down to younger generations. Looking at the delayed effect of something like institutional barriers to swimming had on the black population in the US, how do you think this when it comes to something like housing? The individual action might get the topic out of your head for a second, but it's not a reasonable position. Drafting talking points that sound agreeable and intuitively make sense is all well and good if your only ambition is to be part of a lot of YouTube